a red flag, right? I mean, at the counter. No, I hate Christmas. I don't get into that. The cash register, she stood there, the cash register lady, she stood there like, I mean, she didn't know what to say. I wanted to help her out. I wanted to go over there and be like, don't worry, man. Hey, guy, what's your problem? What's wrong with you? I know what happened. You sat on the Santa's lap when you were a kid. His breath was probably terrible. You've been drinking. He knocked you off his lap on accident. Or he even made you like wear one of the elf outfits. Something bad happened to the guy, man. Nobody walks around bah humbugging Christmas. That's why Scrooge is so popular, because you're like, hey, who's this guy that doesn't like freaking Christmas? That's why the movie works. Yeah, I almost just threw that $900 Yeti cup across the store. Yeah. So anyway, something's wrong with you, man, if you don't like Christmas. I didn't. It was 30, and that was ridiculous. I almost had a flipping heart attack. Yeah, I got the size that, you know, a normal person would use, as opposed to, I have to have this beer cold for 6 weekends straight without putting anything else in it. I mean, no, look, here, that is like when the Yeti thing first came out. Man, this cooler, this will keep whatever, you know, for cold for 6 months. Didn't nobody have the thought like, hey, man, like there's a term, if you got to have your beer cold for 5 days straight without moving, you're an alcoholic. Like, there's a word for that. You're an alcoholic, man. If you need something to keep your beer cold while you're passed out on the beach for 6 days in advance so you can roll over after the 6th day, pop open your cooler and have a cold one, something's wrong with you. Like, go back to the hotel at night, open the refrigerator. You know what? Look, man, if you can't buy the 30-cent styrofoam cooler at the convenience store and that gets you through the day, what are you doing? What are you doing? All right, virtue theory. I guess so. And we're going to get through this. We started it. We didn't go through the objections to it, right? That's not true. You're the ones that don't like do anything. There's a difference between don't know anything and don't do anything. Madison, you got to come up here today because there's nobody. So even if it's just we, right? Yeah, kumbaya. So even if nobody, what? What does that even mean?
Like, I don't know. I can't. It's hard for me to take notes when I'm listening to somebody.
Well, how do you take notes if nobody's saying anything? Take notes right now. Virtue theory, go.
Because she'll take notes. She really good at taking notes.
So you just.
I'll jot
She
down
uses
what
my
I
notes to
can.
write her reflection paper.
I do, because I
So-
can.
I technically have the notes, I just don't write the reflection paper.
The notes.
I have the notes, I just don't turn them in. I
Well-
think that's all I do is turn in notes.
Well, that's essentially all you really have to do to get your
I almost just turn in my notes like bullet points.
to get your
I did that
grade.
one time.
Yeah, I mean, you would at least get something.
And I even put at the bottom, I legit just copied and pasted my notes.
All right. All right. So, what was virtue theory? Right? What was it? It was all about what? Becoming a certain kind of person, right? It wasn't necessarily keying in on just a bunch of rules, right? You were supposed to. The interest or one of the axioms of virtue theory is that you become a certain kind of person, that you have this, you're a person of character. Does that make sense? That you're not just, all right, what's rule Y, what's rule X, and then when I get in situation X or a situation Y, that I follow rule X or Y in situation A. It's not just about looking at a bunch of rules and then trying to like do that rule in the situation. It's about you becoming kind of person. To put it, you know, in poetic language, like that you turn into this thing, right? That you turn into this certain being, you know, that you become a thing as opposed to you're just something that does X, Y, or Z. And we've talked about how this is, even though it's an ethical theory that's popular within philosophical circles, it's also what? It's something that goes around in common circles, right? I mean, like we said, like your parents have probably said something like, what kind of person are you going to be when you grow up if you continue to be a turd like this or whatever, right? Like, what kind of person are you going to be, because, if you do have kids one day or whatever, then you do want them to somewhere in your conscience, conscious thought, you want your kids to be some kind of person, not just rule follower for the sake of following rules. You want them to be the kind of person that wants to do the right thing. Does that make sense? And so that's one of the aspects about virtue theory that the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle, Plato, all those guys would have said, Aquinas, though he's not ancient Greek, obviously, that, wait a minute, why can't you do the right thing, not just because you're supposed to, but because what? Well, that's just like saying supposed to. What? Well, not just because you ought to. That's the same thing as just saying you're supposed to, right? But there's something about doing the right thing because you want to, right? Like, what if you could get to the place in life that the right quote unquote decision was made, not just because you felt like you ought to, but you wanted to be, like, that's who you are. Does that make sense? Like, it's who you are to be honest. It's who you are to be brave. It's who you are to be giving or compassionate or kind or whatever the case may be, right? That's who you are, as opposed to that's just something you do. Does that make sense? Little side note, we were talking about the other day. All right, look, if you like have pulling strings, I want one of those little bracelets, little WW. I want one that says that WWAD, like what would Aristotle do? Just because I think it'd be pretty cool to have one of those. And that's not to slam, any other version of that. But here's a little side note that's pretty funny too. I think it's pretty funny. The little WWJD bracelets, right? Well, a lot of times in our culture, there's this kind of like perpetuation that Jesus of Nazareth was, if you translated Jesus, the Hebrew of Yeshua, which would be Yeshua, right? If you translated that to English, that Yeshua would mean Barney, right? Because essentially he's just this nice, hey, yeah, everything's good. Well, obviously, if you read the account of his life, well, it's pretty funny that, and I think I saw this somewhere. The little bracelets, what WWJD, what would Jesus do? Some guy says, well, remember, if someone ever says, what would Jesus do? You should always remember that within the realm of possibilities, if somebody says, what would Jesus do in this situation? Within the realm of possibilities, that he might flip tables and drive people out with a whip and then call other people the son of the devil, right? So that's kind of the thing, even though that's kind of a funny thing, even in virtue theory, if you were to, because why did I give that example? Because remember, virtue theory is that you look at a quote unquote virtuous person, right? And you try to emulate what? That person, right? Because they're seen to be what? A virtuous person. They embody virtue, right? So you emulate them. So a WWJD bracelet thing is just something like that, right? That's saying, essentially, that person that's wearing one of those bracelets is saying that implicitly, whether they know it or not, that they're holding to some sort of virtue type theory, because they are trying to emulate, in this case, Jesus of Nazareth, right? And asking themselves, all right, in this situation, what would he do, right? And then do likewise, like be like that, become that kind of thing, right? But anyway, that humorous example just goes to show that virtue, it's a misunderstanding of virtue to always think that virtue means, again, like if you translated, good behavior or virtue from the Greek word, I think it's eritis, something like that, maybe. Don't quote me on that. but that it doesn't mean that you're always just sweet or whatever, right? It also means that there's different, like virtue, like being brave is a virtue, right? Confronting evil would be what? That would be virtuous, right? So long as you do it how? Within the mean, right? What was the mean? What was the golden mean? Because remember, how did Aristotle try to help identify what the virtue was? How did he try to help you identify that? What was the golden mean? He said the golden mean was one of the ways, among others, but one of the primary ways in which you identified what virtue was. What was that? What was the golden mean?
I just remember it was like the middle. Did you have like the
Out of the gold one,
yeah, you have like X's or something and then like
you had
Too
A,
little.
not A.
no, you said something about
We had to do two extremes, right?
yeah, there you go.
That's right. So, because remember, think back to your math courses or whatever. Like the mean, remember when you're trying to find the mean of a bunch of numbers, you know, you've got different ways. You can find the median, you can find the average, and you can find the mean, right? The mean was what? Right. So in this sense, like if you had foolhardiness or whatever over here, foolhardiness or rashness, something like that, and then you had cowardice or just complete submissiveness or something like that over here, cowardice, something like that. Well, in the middle, you would have what? The proper balance, right? Which would be something like courage or bravery, right? So Aristotle says, look, these have names. What would these be called? If this is a virtue, then what would these be? Vice, right? The vice is the opposite of the virtue, right? And it may be, so for instance, if you're a person that is just unbelievably rash or foolhardy or whatever, or if you're a coward, or if you are a coward, I can't say you're a coward as often, but if you are a coward, then that's defined as what? A vice. And we've heard that. We've heard people say, what's your vice? Right? We've heard people say something like that. What's your vice? You know, so-and-so has a vice, right?
Question.
Okay, there's your song.
Yeah.
I'm Miranda Lambert.
By Miranda Lambert. It's called Vice.
Have you heard it?
No, I'm not a big country music fan.
Well, I figured you would listen to all genres. I feel like you would understand.
Well, my wife likes it, but I'm not a big fan. So,
Well, I was gonna ask if that's what she was talking about.
well, what does it essentially
It's
say?
like another vice. Something like that. I don't know. I don't like the song, but she said it's called Vice.
I don't know. The song blows chunks, but it says this.
I didn't know if it was-
Probably, I mean, if it's some sort of negative connotation, if the context is negative,
Pretty sure she's calling out Blake Shelton.
I mean,
then, you know, for instance, like smoking, some would consider what? A vice, right? But I mean, classically speaking, it would be something like this up here about the extreme between the golden mean, right? Hey, did you hear that? That rhymed. It's pretty awesome. Didn't even mean to do that. So, no, go ahead. What? I was going to give you some examples just here from your text. Like, so for instance, he says here, and sometimes this text is kind of off, but probably for the most part it's not off here. But anyway, so the mean between being stingy and being completely wasteful would be something like what? What would be the golden mean between those two extremes? Stingy, if you're stingy, that would be one extreme, right? You're tightwad. And then the other extreme would be that you're completely wasteful. Then what would the golden mean be? Something like generous, right? But there's a balance between those, that you don't just go around just throwing all your money and your food out and then your kids starve to death, right? Giving it to everybody. But at the same time, that you're not just ignoring people that need help, right? So there's a balance between there, perfect balance. So Aristotle would say, if you can find that balance, that perfect balance, then that's the virtue, right?
Okay, what I was gonna tell you, I found a PDF that has like a bunch of different examples.
Of that, what we're looking at right now? Right, yeah, there you go. Stuff like that. There you go. Now, and again, we're just this theory, and even the others that we've spoken of, that we've covered, there's going to be more in regards to them, right? I mean, we're doing an intro course, so we're just trying to give an overview of these things, right? We're just trying to at least touch on them so that you're familiar with them. Now, having said that, let's look at some of the objections to virtue theory. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what she is talking about.
What?
That song, Christ.
Oh, well, there you go. See, now you can listen to that and not feel as ignorant. You can be like, oh, yeah. Well, it's getting a little less. We got a little shot there. All right, so what about this first? If you have your book, turn to page 54 if you have it. So the first objection will be something like virtue is compatible with evil. What do you think they mean by that? Because let me guess, surprise, you didn't read this section like you were supposed to. What do you think that this means to say that virtue is compatible with evil? This first objection to it. So his example is what? They find this, the FBI or the federal government or whoever, the G-men raid this mafia organization or whatever, and they find that they have this code essentially that is listed here, something like a Mafia 10 Commandments, something like that. Meaning that they have this again, just this code that they're supposed to follow in regards to being loyal to each other, honest with one another, treat each other with respect, something like that. Does that make sense? So the objection then is that, wait a minute, aren't all of these things supposed to be good things? But if these are good things, these virtues like honesty, integrity, respect, all these sorts of things, if that can be put into place by what you would normally see as quote unquote bad people, then how can those things be good things? Like, meaning to say again, if it seems like virtue, quote unquote, is compatible with evil. Somebody put that in your own words. Who thinks honesty is a good thing? Right. Well, wait a minute. He's saying, well, if you see that as a good thing, and that's supposed to be a good thing, then how is it that mafia people or bad guys or gang members or whatever can be honest with one another and still be bad people? How can they have respect? How can they have respect for their quote unquote authorities within their own organization? Because right, even respect for authority would be a virtue, right? A proper authority, something like that. Now, they're saying, how can all of those things that they're supposedly so good, how can they be completely compatible with those types of things? Does that make sense? Now, I think that that's an interesting objection because, well, it makes you stop and think, well, wait a minute. Yeah, if all of these things are supposed to be quote unquote good things, then how can they be good if they're completely compatible with what we would normally see as, quote, bad people or bad organizations or bad things? Yet
Don't they see it as good? Like for them?
Well, right, but that would just be that'd just be like relativity, right? Not relativity in the scientific sense, but as in like moral relativism, what we're talking about. But that's not what we want to say, right? Because you want to say they really are good things, right? You don't want to say, well, they're just good to them and bad to us, or bad to them and good to us, something like that. You don't want to say that,
So
right?
they're for this?
Well, I think that at least a priori, on the face of it, that those are good, right? So what do we make of that objection then? I think there's a lot of things you can do with it. I mean, I think that that's a very interesting observation, but I don't think that necessarily entails that it's some sort of true objection to what would normally be seen as virtue, right? Because, I mean, one, you might toss out something like, you might say something like, well, wait a minute, is that truly an exhibition of virtue, or is that just an exhibition of a perversion of a right virtue? Something like, in fact, I think Aristotle would even say something like, I forget what the Greek word for it is, but something like practical wisdom, something like that, meaning that you still have to have virtue in a robust and rounded sense. You can't have virtues that are solely in line with what is quote unquote evil or something like that, in line with the wrong allegiances, something like that. Does that make sense? Or even to say that, or even this, even to say that just because they can be used for some sort of evil purpose or in service of evil doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are. Because that's what the objection seems to carry, is that the virtues must be in some way completely 100% neutral if they can be used for either or. But that may or may not follow. That doesn't seem clear that really follows. That they themselves are really not, let's say, good in and of themselves, that they're just completely neutral, those virtues or whatever. In fact, think about it. I mean, if someone were telling you that this were true, if someone were telling you, let's say that this author of this textbook is telling you that, wait a minute, how can honesty be, really a good thing if it's compatible with it? Because honesty is what? A virtue, right? That's traditionally looked at as a virtue, that you're an honest person. But if honesty is not a virtue, then why would we expect for the author to be honest with us in telling us that honesty is not a virtue? Does that make sense? That almost seems in some way to be possibly at least flirting with being self-defeating, right? I mean, don't we expect him to be honest with us in regards to telling us if honesty is or isn't a virtue? But if it's not a virtue, if it's not virtuous, or if it's not quote unquote good to be honest, then why should we expect him to be honest to us? Or something like that, maybe. And of course, that might have to be cashed out and even played out over the other virtues. But I think that that helps to reveal that, let's say these groups or people that are traditionally seen as bad groups or bad people, traditionally speaking, it still reveals that they expect what? To be treated a certain way by each other, right? So, as we've said before, maybe we shouldn't look so much at what those people are doing, but look at their reactions to give us a clue as to how people are or aren't supposed to behave, right? For instance, somebody may say, there's no real right and wrong, but then we really see what they really believe about that by what? Not their actions, but what? Their reactions, how they act when somebody does something wrong to them, right? They say, well, there's really no real right or wrong, but then we see them contradicting themselves when someone cuts in front of them in line, or when someone treats their family, whatever, right? Something like that. I don't know. That's just something to toy with right off the bat. So anyway, we can see how others, and specifically these guys here, say these gang members or whatever else, we see how they expect to be treated by one another, right? But why expect that if those in and of themselves aren't good things, right? Why expect to be treated honestly or respectfully or in such a way that honors proper authority or something like that? Why expect that if those things aren't necessarily good in and of themselves? Again, maybe it's just that their allegiances are off. Maybe virtue theory speaks to something about proper allegiance to begin with, right? In fact, it seems like, think about this, it seems like you're going to be you're going to have some sort of allegiance to something, right? Whether it be to yourself, or whether it be to this, in this example, this gang boss or whatever, or whether it be the government, or whether it be your parents, or whether it be God, whatever. It seems like you're going to have some sort of allegiance to something, right? Again, even if it's just yourself. that you're aligning those things with something or someone, right? Let's look at the second example. It says clashing virtues. You remember when we were talking about Kant's deontology, where it seemed like you had these moral dilemmas, and what do you do when they conflict with one another? Does that make sense? You remember that? Like, what do you do? Again, standard everyday example. Nazis at the door. Do you have any Jews? Are you hiding any Jews? Well, remember Kant's system, you know, the conflicting moral duties, but you're supposed to always tell the truth, right? But what about, you know, saving the lives of these people, right? Well, apparently this author says that virtue theory has the same sort of difficulty. That, well, wait, what do you, if it's virtuous to be an honest person, but then it's virtuous to be a kind person, then what do you do if your wife says, hey, does this dress make my ace look fat? Well, do you tell, or if you're virtuous and you entail the virtue of honesty, but you also are virtuous and you're kind or whatever, well, then which virtue is supposed to bear out in that situation? Kindness? No, honey, you look fantastic. I got to go run an errand real quick. Or does honesty, does that virtue bear out in that situation? Well, I mean, you look like you've been sucking down Crisco for about 6 months when you put that dress on. So which virtue is supposed to bear out there, right? Well, I mean, that's the point. That's the objection, isn't it? Because honesty is supposed to be a virtue. Well, which one bears out there? Which one's supposed to bear out there in that situation? Now, I think that what was one of the proposed solutions for Kant's system? Well, not specifically Kant's, because Kant didn't want to allow for that. But remember, another deontological system was divine command theory, something like that. Remember, and one of the solutions that they tried to offer in regards to those conflicting moral rules or moral dilemmas was what? Remember graded absolutism, that there was a hierarchy to those things. That you remember? Do you remember that? For instance, it's always wrong. What? You have a standing moral obligation to tell the truth, right? But telling the truth has to merge or give way to what every time? Something like saving lives, right? Protecting innocence, something like that. So maybe it's possible that virtue theory adopts something like that. That virtue theory has something like that where even maybe the virtues are even in some sort of hierarchy or order, so to speak. I don't know. I mean, we're just tossing out stuff. We're just thinking of stuff like that. Now I know, and again, because we just can't get into depth in it because it's introductory, but again, this is again where I think it's phonesis maybe, where Aristotle says, no, this calls for something like practical wisdom, meaning that the virtues aren't blind and naked by themselves. Like you have to literally practice them and hone them out as you grow and as you develop and all those sorts of things. Again, anyway, it's an interesting objection to kind of look at. There's a couple different things there.
Deciding between the two different ones, basically.
Or yeah, or not just deciding, but how does the system itself, how does virtue theory itself solve that problem, right? I mean, you may know how you would decide. Oh, well, I'm just going to be kind right now, or I'm just going to be honest right now. Like you may know how you would decide it, but the problem, the objection is, well, if that system, remember, because all of these are supposed to tell you how to behave, right? That's the whole point of ethical theories, is they're supposed to tell you how you are supposed to what? Behave, right? That's the whole point of these things. Well, if something like that comes up, we have these clashing virtues. Well, then the system, how does the system tell you you're supposed to behave? That's supposed to be the objection there, right? Now, this third objection he has listed is, I think, a pretty bad one. I think it's interesting in the sense of looking at, but logically and philosophically, I don't think really much flows from it. And he said the objection is there seems to be a possible relativism about virtues. Remember, moral relativism was what? You say what? You say that's wrong, I say it's right, right? There is no absolute moral rights or wrongs. Everything's completely relative in regards to moral truth, right? Remember that moral relativism? Well, the objection here is, well, wait a minute, what about the Amish who say modesty is good and all these sorts of things? And then and he gives an example of the world naked bike ride or something, where they say that that's not necessarily a good, it's virtuous to be free with your body and all these kind of things. If you were to respond the exact same way, how we might respond to moral relative, the claims that morals are relative, how might you respond to something like that? What might be a response to that objection? Remember when we talked about, when there's a lack of consensus, what logically follows from that? Remember, if we put the examples we went over and over and over again, if every kid in my wife's third grade classroom, whatever, gets the math problem wrong because there's a lack of consensus, no one agrees, does it follow that there's not a right answer? Does it follow? No, it doesn't follow, right? It doesn't follow that because there's a lack of consensus that there's not some sort of right answer. It may be you just have to actually do the difficult job of finding what it is, right? Now, there may not be a right answer to something, but it doesn't follow that lack of consensus is what gives you that. Or remember the other example we gave, if you put a jar of jelly beans or whatever on the counter and you tell everyone to try to guess the number of jelly beans in the jar, does it follow that if everyone disagrees that there's not a right number of jelly beans? Does it follow? No. It just means what? All that follows from lack of consensus is what? What follows from lack of consensus? Lack of consensus. That's all you get from that, right? And even there, though, I mean, some would say, well, no, both think modesty's right. Even the world naked bike riders or whatever, and the Amish think modesty's right. They just disagree as to what is or isn't what? Proper what? Modesty. Does that make sense? Like the Amish would say, well, no, this is immodest, and the world naked bike people or whatever might say, well, no, that's not immodest, but this over here, this, even though they're naked on their bicycles, there's probably some sort of behavior that they would say is what? Immodest, right? So it may not be that they don't think that immodesty or modesty is not a virtue. They just disagree with what? The fact of what counts as what? Immodesty. Does that make sense? Like, for instance, the world naked bike people might say something like, well, it would be, look, guys, I know there's some of you want to ride your bicycles naked and, watch, dirty movies on your bicycle as we drive down the street. But that would be really immodest. I don't think that's appropriate, right? So even they, I don't know if that's true or not at all, but even they, again, might what? See something as immodest, right? They're just in disagreement with the Amish or whoever. So both of them think modesty's right. They're just confused as to where it is, right? Where like it is. Maybe they're just wrong on one sense of that, right? Maybe one of them is too far over or too far left or too far right. It doesn't follow that there's not one. Now, your book also says here something about Aristotle argued that human beings have a function. And remember, that really goes exactly along with what we talked about with natures and essences. Remember, with natural law theory, something like that. I think that he really downplays Aristotle's purpose here, because Aristotle's purpose is not just merely function, as if if he's talking about something that just happens to do something. Aristotle is really talking about what? It's a more robust sense of that word. Purpose. Remember, Aristotle there's not just function. Something doesn't just function, but Aristotle thought things had a what? A true what? Purpose. Not that they just happened to behave some certain way or they did some certain thing, but they actually were made to do some sort of thing based on his metaphysical stance of what? Final causality, right? And he thought that if you could discover something's purpose, then that helped you to see what? Natural law theory, what? That that's the way it ought to be, right? You remember that? Now, the last is I really think is odd. Well, I don't think it's odd. I mean, it's a popular objection, but I think really there's a lot that flows from that. Is the last objection is that there's just no such thing as character. That Mad Madison and Mad Madeline don't have a disposition to do something in one way or the other, meaning that it's just a useful fiction to say that Mad Madison and Mad Madeline and I was going to come up with you a crazy nickname, but it just slipped my mind. I was going to give everybody a crazy nickname all of a sudden. But they would just say that you don't have, that you're generally not a quote unquote honest person. You're just honest given this set of circumstances. In this set of, or in this specific scenario, but there's no such thing as you having a certain disposition to behave a certain way based on character, your character. You don't have a character. You don't have any character. There's no such thing as that. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Do you follow that? Now, why do they say this? They say this is based off certain psychological studies, that it's a more accurate, you can make a more accurate prediction of how somebody will be based on the circumstance that they're in, based on the scenario they're in, over and above what kind of quote unquote character traits they have. Now, what problems do you see with that objection? I mean, really, no one has any certain sort of dispositions? Like no one is more likely, I give an example, supposedly a generous person would be much more likely to stop and help someone, right? But they quote these studies where no, if the person, it's more likely that if they were in a big hurry, even if they were quote unquote supposedly a generous person, they were less likely to help somebody than the person who was not in a hurry, even if that person was not supposedly a generous person. Does that make sense? They're saying, wait a minute, if this person's a generous person, supposedly has this character disposition of being generous, then why is it that when they're in a hurry, they're less likely to help that person than somebody who's not in a hurry, who's not even supposed to be generous? Because they say you would think it'd be the opposite, right? You would think that the person who is supposedly this generous person has this disposition or this character of being generous, that it'd be more reliable that they're going to be the ones to stop and help the person. But we've shown through studies that if that person's in a hurry, they're much less likely to stop and help them, even though they're supposedly generous. Right. Right. But that doesn't really say, I don't think that really says a lot. Because how is it to say that you're still not overall generous, that you have some sort of generous disposition, that you have some sort of generous character, so to speak, when you've created a circumstance that's going to bar that character trait from displaying itself? Does that make sense? For instance, do you think if let's look at the example. If someone is supposedly generous, and they didn't know they were in the study, and then someone came along and said, you supposedly have a character trait of being generous, but you didn't help this person here. Why didn't you do that? What do you think the person would say? I think this is just, at least this is something to think about right off the bat. What do you think that person would say? I was in a big hurry. I was in a hurry. So what I mean to say is this: if they say I was in a hurry, does that not say that? Does that not implicitly admit that they normally, quote unquote, would be generous, but there's an external circumstance that's borrowing from instantiating that particular behavior at that particular time? Because what does the person not say? Essentially what they do, they gave an excuse, right? Meaning, but when you give an excuse, when you give a justification for your behavior, you're tacitly admitting that that's what you ought to have done, right? Otherwise, you would have said what? The person would have said what? Oh, why didn't you help them? I was in a hurry. And I don't give a shit. But they didn't say that. Why would they not say that? You see what I'm saying? If they still don't recognize the way they were supposed to have behaved, then why would they give an excuse? Why would they say, oh, well, because I was in a hurry? Does that make sense? What I mean to say is this. These examples, they just seem to be examples of justifications or examples of excuses for not doing what the person may normally do, have all things being equal. Because here's the thing, Aristotle himself, no one has ever said that virtue theory doesn't account for, or character, I should say, doesn't account for external circumstances. Even Aristotle will say you're not free to do whatever you want to do, even given your character. Why? Because there's external circumstances that are affecting you. A more interesting study would say, all things being equal, what? What would the person who is supposedly generous do? And what would the person who is not generous do? Does that make sense? For instance, to me, it sounds like you're saying, like, all right, this person's supposedly strong. This guy supposedly has a lot of muscle. He's supposed to be a very strong guy. But we found out that if you break his arm, he's much less likely to bench press as much as the guy over here who's not supposed to be weak, or the guy who is supposedly weak. Well, duh, right? If you toss in some monkey wrench, well, then of course it's going to alter the way the person is normally going to behave, or they might normally behave. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So you can't say, well, this person's supposedly generous, but we gave him $1 today to feed his whole family. And we gave this other guy who's not generous at all $5. This guy didn't give as much money. He's supposedly generous. Well, duh. If you threw in some sort of external factor that's going to alter his decision-making process, or that's going to contribute to his decisions, well, then it shouldn't be a surprise. Just like saying, well, this guy supposedly is very strong, but we found out if we broke his arm, he couldn't bench as much as the guy who was supposedly weak. Well, obviously. Now, maybe that's why we need to look more into these studies to see what they actually do or don't show. Because here's one of the ramifications that come to that. If it's really more about your circumstances and not about you, then why blame people when they do wrong? Think about that. If your behavior and your circumstance is not ultimately about your character or the way you want to behave or the decisions that you make, if your behavior is really just contrived by your circumstances, then why blame anyone for having done anything wrong when they really, at the end of the day, aren't really that responsible for what they did? It was really more the circumstances that they found themselves in. Does that make sense? Why have a court system? Why have punishment at all? In fact, that's why we see a lot of people that don't believe we should have penal type punishment. That is what's called retributive justice as opposed to restorative justice. It works the opposite way too, right? Who are the first people that want to accept praise when they do something right? Everybody, right? But if that's true, why give anybody praise? If it was really what? More a result of what? The circumstance. If their behavior was just really more a result of the circumstantial scenario they're in, well, just like you can't really place blame in any real sense of the word, well, then why can you give anyone praise? Why should you tell anyone that they did a good job or they did a good thing when it was really more the result of what? The circumstance or the scenario. Now, we may be oversimplifying here, and that's fine, but if the objection itself is going to be simplistic, then just a reply to the objection might be, simplistic. I mean, again, that's why we have to look really deeper into the issue than what unfortunately warrants us for time and introductory purposes, right? I will say this. I will say that I think that virtue theory completely left by itself is kind of, it seems to be wanting for something there, right? Because again, if you are supposed to look at somebody that's good, right? If you're supposed to look at someone that's good and emulate that behavior, well, then how do you know the person you're supposed to look for? Because remember, that's virtue theory is supposed to tell you, just basically it assumes that you're just going to know what good people do, right? But if you already know what good people do, then why do you need virtue theory to tell you what good is? Does that make sense? So I think that you have to have that in something like conjunction with like natural law or like rules of some sort, principles, ethical principles of some sort. Does that make sense?
We're trying to determine how something is, or how we know how something.
Right, because all these ethical theories are supposed to what? Give us the way that we ought to behave, right? But how do we know what good is? Or how do we know which ethical system to put into place if that's what's supposed to tell us what good is to begin with? Right, something like that. That's why I think natural law, honestly, this is just my own personal view, but that's why I think something like natural law is the most, makes the most sense, because it's telling you that that you have this ability to find out what is what based off the observation of natures and essences, right? Something like that. That you can abstract these things and you can find out what the good is, right? Otherwise, how else would you know? Because again, we've looked at a lot of these others to be, again, being rational. Well, you can be completely rational and come up with things that contradict one another in regards to ethical theories, right? And they're just as rational as the other ones. Does that make sense? So I think that, and again, this is my opinion, but to me, at the end of the day, I like something like natural law combined with something like virtue theory, and then maybe a bit of some sort of deontological ethical theory, maybe even divine command, something like that. Does that make sense? I think that it seems like you have to have some sort of combo, at least in some way, to put some of these together. But even my view would be something like, at rock bottom, something like natural law. Because like we've talked about before, think about it. Where is natural law the most explicitly well, I don't know if I should say explicitly, maybe strongly implied. Which document within our nation isn't something like natural law strongly, strongly, strongly implied or spoken of? If laws are given to you by the government, then who can take away if your rights are given to you by your government? Who thinks, all right, let's say it this way. Who thinks your rights are given to you by the government? That they are. Who thinks your rights are given to you by your government? Because here's the problem. If your rights are given to you by the government, then what can the government do? Take them away. And then if the government takes away your rights, who can you complain to say you're violating my rights? No one. Right? If your rights are given to you by the government, if that's the authority backing your human rights as a human being, if that's what gives you your rights, well, if the government decides against you and takes away your rights, then what are you appealing to say that that's not right or that's not fair? There is none, right? So like when MLK said, all right, even though it's the law of the land that segregation is okay and all these sorts of things, he was saying that was wrong, but he couldn't be appealing to the government because the government was in opposition to him, right? What was he appealing to? What moral code was he appealing to? Right, something like natural law. And so what I said earlier, which document, think about it, guys. The founding fathers were appealing to natural law when they said, what? That the tyranny that they had been under by the English government was wrong, right? They were appealing to that. In fact, what did they say? Endowed to us by what? The Creator with certain unalienable rights. I mean, let that sink in. All right, anybody want to add anything? So, in conclusion, we went over a lot of ethical theories, right? I mean, we've went over moral relativism, which strictly speaking isn't an ethical theory. It's a descriptive type of account of morality, right? And we found that to be seriously wanting, that morals are completely relative. We went over utilitarianism, and even though it had some interesting points and some things to offer, it still seemed to have some very difficult, even powerful objections, right? Namely, that nothing really in and of itself was wrong. It's possible to justify all sorts of what we would normally see as just egregious and heinous evils, right? We looked at Kant's deontology, and we saw that it was very, very valuable in the sense that it made this really nice attempt to ground absolute and objective and even absolute moral rules and principles in logic and reason and rationality. But, it seemed to have some problems. We looked at divine command theory, and, it seemed to really work nicely with the meta-ethical problem, the grounding objection to any moral norms or whatever, assuming that God, say, exists. But then even it had some problems in the sense of if it's supposed to be thought of as a complete system, it looks like it has to be used in conjunction with something else. So, I mean, it had some things to look at. We looked at natural law theory. That has fallen, out of favor in modern times that we've talked about because, the metaphysical framework has been largely denied. So that would be a problem. You'd have to have a really good argument to try to carry that into the public marketplace, right? In the marketplace of ideas. And then we looked at virtue theory, and even though it seems virtuous, it seems to have, a couple difficulties. So at the end of the day, I mean, we've got all of these ethical theories that are supposed to give us normative ethical, you can't say ethical theories and then use ethical in the flipping thing you're saying. Anyway, you're supposed to tell us how to behave, right? Let's say it that way. It's supposed to help us to see what the good is and then how to do it, right? And I think there's some interesting theories there. Interesting theories. There's some really good ones there. Some, I think, bad ones. But almost all of them, save one, if God exists, really have a problem with, I think, the meta-ethical issue of grounding them. Again, any sense of true moral obligation that, for instance, that you ought to follow any of them, right? Again, that grounding objection, if there is no God, so to speak. So I think that's something that we have to take into consideration. Let me leave you guys with a thought, and I think you'll like this. This has nothing to do, well, it does have something to do with philosophy. You know, on Facebook, it gives you little memories for the day or whatever. You know what I'm talking about? Like, remember this from 50 years ago. You remember? All right. Listen to this. Here it goes. It says, this was my memory from like 3 or 4 years ago, whatever. And it's a Thanksgiving thing, so that's all we can live with. You know, I should have brought my guitar today and sang the Adam Sandler Thanksgiving song. Thanksgiving. All right, ready? Here it is. It says, it was dark when I was awakened by the sound of a few small cries from my youngest daughter. Perhaps it was 6:15. I remained still for just a moment. I slowly turned to watch my wife and my oldest little girl sleep peacefully by my side next to one another, close to one another. Lily held her doll close to her chin. The fan created its rhythmical popping sound. It is never turned off, therefore it is almost never heard. Though it was hard to see, my wife's red hair was gently moved by the fan's breeze, and it was in contrast to the white pillowcase. Even still, it was hard to see in the still darkness. I quietly removed the covers as not to wake the 2 sleeping girls, and I remember being cold. I made my way into the room of my youngest. She had wiggled out from under her covers, and though sleep was pursuing her, she was cold. Her eyes were closed. I put my hands on her cool skin. I picked her up slowly. Her head fell easily on my chest as I made my way slowly and softly back to our room. I remember her thin, baby-like hair tickling my ear while she snuggled into my shoulder. It is blonde. I lay her down close to her sister. Her sister by now is curled up into her mother's side. The bed has kept its warmth, and I lie back down. My youngest beside me, she beside her sister, and she beside her mother. And I love them. I listen to the fan twirl, and I listen to the little ones move towards one another. I watch the oldest stroke the blonde hair of my youngest. She succumbs to sleep, warm. Is what I felt more than the desire to see my offspring produce further generations provided me by electrochemical patterns and neurological firings? Is what we feel more than a mechanism that has kept the species perpetuated? I believe that it was, and I believe that it is. I believe in love, I believe in God, and I believe in being thankful for this morning. Happy Thanksgiving. There you go.
I feel like that should